Good afternoon, everyone. I hope this finds you well. This is Caradina Sale with the McSilver Institute, along with the Community Technical Assistance Center, also known as CTAC, and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, also known as MIGTAC of New York State. I really want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is called The Foundations of the Play Therapy Relationship, presented by Ann Beckley Forrest, who is a licensed social worker in private practice in Buffalo, New York. Her specialties include attachment and child and adolescent trauma, and she also works with adult survivors. She's a registered play therapist and supervisor. She's also an EMDR-approved consultant and a faculty member of the Child Trauma Institute. So we found Ann, and we're very lucky that we found her, and she has a lot of knowledge to share with you today around the foundations of play therapy. So welcome. And before we get started, though, I want to just orient you to our WebEx system. I'm sure many of you have been here before, but if you haven't, I just want you to know that you are placed on mute to avoid any background noises. If you come across any technical issues today, please chat to Foong, our host, who will be able to assist you. And I will also be chatting with you in the chat box as well. And you can send any questions through the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will get to questions at the end, but you can submit them throughout, and Foong and I will be capturing them. Without further ado, I will now pass it on to Ann. Thank you so much, Ann.
Hello. Good morning. I'm very excited about doing this today. So I hope that you're all as excited as I am this lunch hour. I'm coming to you from Buffalo, where there is a lot of snow on the ground. So I think that's kind of a theme across New York. What I'm going to be doing today is talking about the play therapy mentality in child treatment. Obviously, in a 1-hour webinar, I can't tell you everything I know about play therapy, but hopefully whet your appetite, talk a little bit about theory and how that underpins what we do in play therapy, and give you some examples of some play therapy type interventions, what play therapy looks like in practice. So I wanted to start off just by thinking a little bit about putting on a child's eyes in order to be effective as therapists with children. Now, children really will play no matter what their circumstances. They'll play with anything. But if we want to have children get therapy in their native language, it's important to provide a playful environment. And so just to get in that mood for a moment, I want you to think for just a second of what was your favorite toy when you were a child? What was the thing you liked to play with the most? And you can share it. If you're watching this with colleagues, you can share with each other, or if you want to use the chat right now and chat everyone and just let us know what was something that you played with as a child. What was your favorite toy? Just be thinking about that for a minute. I was a Barbie kid, and I loved, dressing Barbie up, making up all kinds of stories. My sister and I, had Barbie run for president. We had a lot of stuff going on there back in the 70s with Barbie. Oh, some answers are coming in. Light Bright. That was the one I loved, too. Lots of Barbie friends out there. I'm just watching the chat roll by. Legos, right? That's an incredibly creative toy. So I think it's important, in order to be a good child therapist, we have to bring the play in some kind of way. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But I just love seeing all the chats roll in from around the state. That's great. Thank you for answering and putting on your child eyes as we get going today. So my background is I started out in working with adolescents, actually, and then got a job working with younger kids, and didn't really, while I had a pretty good theory base, I thought, for human change and human difficulties, I did not have a lot of experience trying to provide that therapy to younger kids. And so what I did I did traditional cognitive behavioral therapy with, smaller words and brightly colored pieces of paper, and I tried to make it a little bit more interactive. And what I found is that sometimes I was really disappointed with the results. And so I'm bringing to mind, as I always do in this training, a 9-year-old boy that I worked with who was just very feisty, spunky, Cute kid, but the kind of kid that got into a lot of trouble. I can still picture him now. He had a little mullet. And he was a kid who would get himself in trouble because of regulation problems. And this is like so many of the kids that we work with. And so, in my work with him, I found myself trying to reason with him about the kinds of behaviors that were helpful to him and not helpful. And it was difficult for him to carry over. He would agree with me in the session that, hey, getting up and running around the room is going to lead you to trouble and is not going to be it's not going to be a great move for you. And what happened is, of course, that he would agree with me in the session. We would even do a little behavioral planning. Then, as happens so often, he would go back to school, back to home, and he had a lot of trouble carrying over, accessing that conversation once he was out in the world. And so I think that a lot of times the results of therapy with children are disappointing for everyone. And what we want to do is have them learn more thoroughly and more deeply. And, most of us who work with kids realize that kids need to learn through experience. And play therapy is one of the ways that we can provide that experience. Children and young adolescents are different from adults. So we know this, but we sometimes have not responded in terms of our therapeutic interventions appropriately to this knowledge. We know that children, especially like under age 10 to 12, are concrete thinkers. They're less likely to be able to abstract or be able to carry over anything based on insight into their daily lives. We also know that emotionally, children are extremists, and they go from, everything's either perfect or awful. There's either a 0 or a 10. And we also know that they're tactile and kinesthetic learners. And so, working with a kid like Wilson that I was just talking about, one of the first things I should have been doing was moving while we were learning, because that is one of the ways in which kids take in information is through movement. And play therapy readily lends itself to that. So in play therapy, we can give kids a space to experiment. And that's regardless of what kind of play therapy approach we use. And we're going to be talking about some of the different play therapy approaches because it's kind of a big tent, and there's a lot of different approaches that call themselves play therapy. But just speaking in general, play provides a laboratory for experimentation. And when we're working through emotions, behavioral changes, then it gives kids a chance to experiment with that. Adults are often experiential learners too, and we know that even in adult therapy, if we can get clients to practice something in the room versus just talk about things, that they do better in therapy and they're more likely to carry those changes over into their daily lives. So some of this works for adults too. All right, let's go on. Let's talk a little bit about where this all comes from. I love the quote from Plato that you can discover more about a person in an hour of play than a year of conversation. And so even as a diagnostic approach, inviting children to play in the therapy room, even Plato's going to give you some credibility there, that it is helpful to have even an assessment of how a child enters the world through the invitation to play. And the inventor of kindergarten felt that it was the expression of what's in a child's soul. There's a long tradition of understanding that play is the language of children and is the way that children can express and project what's going on internally. Even going back to Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter, who's actually the first person to use play or play therapy setting, mostly for diagnosis. And then there's been a lot of thinkers, one of my favorite being John Dewey, who talked about a learning theory based on experimentation and play. And so when we're thinking about how we want to teach skills to children, learning them in play is going to be the best way to go. Now, people come as therapists from a lot of different theoretical models, and one of the important things is that we're not just playing randomly. We have a theory base that underpins what we're doing. And, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just to, kind of run through these very quickly. Some people see children's, development as the primary focus of care, especially if you're working with kids who have some of the organic disorders. And there's a lot of tradition within play therapy for working from a developmental perspective. And especially using game-based corrective experiences or teaching experiences to fill in the gaps. And I've got some authors on the bottom of these slides. I understand these slides will be available for you to download afterwards, and I just wanted to give people a starting point if you want to read more about some of these different theories. Attachment theory, something that, we're very aware of right now, that we understand that emotional problems are often developed in the context of adequate or inadequate parenting and, the needs of the child being met in infancy. And so in play therapy, there's a long tradition of working with the parent-child dyad, as well as having corrective experiences with the therapist that can begin to shift some of those attachment patterns. And so I listed some of the kind of better known ones, including Theraplay, which some of you may know about, which is a very directive child-parent dyad therapy where the parent and child sort of reenact the kinds of games they would have played in infancy in an attached situation. Parent-child interaction therapy, which is kind of similar work but with older children and coaches the parent on how to interact. And developmental play therapy, which is the work of Viola Brody. So just wanted to give you some ideas about where you might go for attachment-based play therapy. I'm somebody who's interested in temperament and how it comes out in play therapy with children because a lot of times what we're seeing in children who come for therapy is we're seeing poor fit between the parent's temperament and the child. So, even going back to this, talk about my kiddo Wilson that I was talking about at the beginning of the hour, that he'd kind of gotten labeled hyper and, overactive. In a very high-energy family with a get-up-and-go kind of a teacher, a kid like that might not even have been in therapy at all. So we do know that fit matters for kids. And so one of the nice things about play therapy is that in a play therapy environment that's child-centered, which we're going to talk about what that means in a minute, there's a lot of attunement available to the child. And I like to think about the 100-acre wood as the place where all the temperaments are allowed to flourish, and trying to make our therapy welcoming to children of all different temperaments as well. So I came up during the family systems era in the 90s, is when I was in grad school, and so I was really taught to view the behavior of children as serving a purpose in the family dynamic. And so one of the things I actually started out in training as a family therapist, one of the things that I had trouble with is I didn't think my family therapy training helped me to involve the younger children in family therapy. And, the techniques worked very well when children were older and able to kind of sit and engage verbally with the parents. But in the play therapy world, there is a definite tradition of whole family play. And so I put a couple authors there for you to consider: the filial play therapy model, Gary Landreth; family puppet story, which is Eliana Gill; and Adlerian play therapy, which is a whole approach to play therapy based on the person-centered theory of Adler, Robert Adler. And Terry Kottman has written a lot about how to use that kind of play, family play, to get some of those goals accomplished. And then I now really consider myself primarily a trauma-informed play therapist, and therefore kind of a prescriptive play therapist who borrows from different play therapy approaches based on the needs of the child, particularly because we now see that early adverse experiences, traumatic, upsetting events, and how the body as well as the mind responds to these are the key to understanding the reactivity that we see in kids. So some of the authors that are, really writing about how to do gradual exposure work to the elements of the trauma. Virginia Axline, who's one of the mothers of play therapy, certainly recognized the trauma-informed approach in her work. And Eliana Gill, Paris Goodyear-Brown, some more recent authors who've written extensively about how to use play therapy in a trauma-informed way. So I want to direct you to their work as well. All right, I don't want to spend too much time on the history of play therapy. Some of you may have come across this book, Dibs in Search of Self, which is the classic play therapy book in grad school. And it's a case study, a single case study of how playing in a play therapy room helped one child to overcome traumatic events. And then a lot of the material that we're going to talk about relating to child-centered play comes from Gary Landreth, who is, still with us and still teaching, and wrote the Play Therapy, The Art of the Relationship, which I think of as, a major contribution to the notion of the importance of how to be with children in therapeutic space, because it doesn't actually come naturally. It's a lot of work for us as adults to do that. So over the last couple of decades, there's been more research, more standardization, and more of a professionalization of play therapy as an approach. Sometimes play therapy has a bad reputation among other professions because, your colleagues are looking in your office and seeing all the toys and saying, what are you doing in there anyway? You're just playing with kids. So it's very important, and what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is that the environment is part of the intervention, and the materials that we use in the play therapy environment are selected deliberately. And part of the power of the play therapy environment is its power as a projective space, as a space in which children can externalize what's going on internally and then can have experiments and mastery experiences. If you think about a child who maybe is an anxious child or has a lot of fears, a lot of those kids will come into the playroom very tentative at first, and over time become more and more bold in their narrative, and they tend to have big imaginations, as a lot of anxious kids do. That's part of what feeds their anxiety. And they'll use that imagination to create all kinds of situations of threat and then experiment with mastering the threat. And you can see how that contributes to their ability to have a felt experience of getting stronger. So the therapist participation is also deliberate, and it's based on what the goals that we have for the child. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, there are different approaches within play therapy, but we're all focused on the goals for the child. So this is kind of a packed slide, but I wanted to include it. Play therapists talk about the core therapeutic powers of play, but there are many, many ways in which play is the mechanism. And so it's not just about making therapy more attractive to children, although certainly play therapy is more attractive to children than traditional talk therapy, but it's also about harnessing the therapeutic power of play and thinking about how play serves a number of needs that are compatible with the things we want for folks in therapy. We want them to have improved social relationships. And we want them to feel stronger a lot of times. And so the act of playing, narratives and playing through to completion is often very powerful for kids in increasing their self-esteem and their sense of agency. Also, the ability to express the self and really to access the unconscious. So I don't know if any of the colleagues who are watching today are from the expressive therapy end of the continuum, art therapy, drama, music. And, there is a definite tradition in using, being able to access the unconscious or the things that are not, more right brain material. And in trauma therapy, we've discovered how important this is, that a lot of times our logical mind, our linear thinking can shut down parts of our experience. And so in play, things come out that wouldn't come out otherwise. And that's another way in which that the power of play is useful. All right, so if you are a therapist working with children, obviously we want to build the kind of relationship that will be fruitful for children. And one of our first tasks in doing that is how do we build safety? How do we convey, not just with our words, but with our actions to children that this is a safe space in which their feelings are welcome and their, thoughts and needs and interests and ideas are okay. And, I will be talking to you a little bit about child-centered play therapy, which I think of as kind of the foundation skill in play therapy, the ability to let the child take the lead. And that is, for a lot of kids, it does help them to feel safer with the therapist because by the time they get to us, there have been a lot of adults involved in trying to fix whatever the problems are. Maybe the teacher, the principal, the parent, maybe grandma, neighbors have all weighed in. And it's not easy for children to engage readily with the therapist because there's often a lot of shame around the behavioral or emotional problems by the time they come to therapy. So in a play therapy environment enables children to relax and not feel like they're in the principal's office. And I think that's very important. And I'm actually really cautious with how I engage with the children, even from the very first minute of therapy, even during the assessment. I'm trying to find ways to avoid having the parents have to give a full account of the child's, problem behaviors in front of the child in the first hour that we're meeting. And so I've tried to get creative with how to, get that assessment material, but to do it in a way that does not compromise safety for the child. So, another goal in the play therapy relationship is to understand things from the child's perspective, which is important because a lot of times the problems are being described by adults, but we don't necessarily know how the child sees things. And we don't want to assume that the parents have it right in terms of what the dynamics are or what might be distressing or upsetting for the child. And, the empowerment piece is a big one because therapy works best between equals. But a child who comes to therapy is inherently unequal with the adult. And for a lot of kids, they will end up setting up the interaction with the adult to, either as, an adult-defying interaction or an adult-pleasing interaction. And so play therapy has taught me to be cautious with how I even use approval and disapproval of the things children make or the things they do, because I want the space to be neutral space where they can project what's going on with them and not be just doing or saying things to please me or to defy me, if that's their attachment pattern. But instead, this becomes a space that's really for them to use. Talked about active learning already. I just think everything that kids learn while they're moving and doing is just more likely to stick to them. So. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about what play therapy looks like. In case you don't know, a lot of play therapists will use sand tray, in part because it's a good projective space that fits in neatly in the kind of room where most of us are forced to do our work. And you can have a wide variety of materials which children can use to tell whatever stories are coming up for them. And so, we try to have a variety, try to have human figures as well as animals, as well as landscape items to make it possible to set the scene. And really what you're thinking about is about projective space. So I think it's very important to have, plenty of aggressive or threatening miniatures as well, because a lot of times children are looking for a way to visually represent the kind of unsafe situations they've been in, or they're not necessarily doing it literally. They're not literally reenacting the things that have happened in their lives, but it's the emotional content that comes through in the way that they use the miniatures. And we always are projecting. There's a whole theory called object relations theory, which, would say that a lot of times when children are playing, there's an item in the play that is themselves, that is their self-object. And I've seen this over and over in the playroom, that children will often latch on to a favorite toy, and then they will have a story that carries a lot of emotional content for them, and sometimes it becomes a favorite story they want to reenact over and over again. And that gives us the opportunity as the therapist to hold the space for them to work through some of those things. In addition to sand tray and miniatures, which a lot of people use, also having puppets. This is especially important if you work with younger children, because for them the miniatures can become frustrating because they don't have the fine motor skills. And so stuffed animals and puppets are more of a large motor toy, and gives them the ability to make stories. And also I sometimes use the puppets directively to carry messages or learning if I'm doing some directive interventions. It's a little bit more fun to communicate with a puppet than it is with me. So, and then different kinds of toys that can be used for role play. And it's interesting because, if you have a child working in miniature, that's a certain kind of experience of distancing from the emotional content of the play. In role play, it's very first person and it's very up close. And so sometimes I will see kids who have intense emotional content that they want to convey. Will use use the role play, just some simple dress-up items, as well as things like a doctor's kit. I have in my office, I have a few household-type props, like a little stove and some play food, also babies and baby doll care, because a lot of children who have, lacks or problems with attachment will have want to use those kinds of projected items. And then just in general, a comfortable space. And I also have a picture of my dollhouse there. Art supplies too, especially if you work with older kids. They might be less likely to play with toys, more likely to use creative materials to make art or make three-dimensional art. And so that can be very useful for them as well. So these are not pictures of my office, by the way. I am sitting in my office right now. You can kind of see I have some of my toys behind me, but these are some very elaborate playrooms. You don't have to have a playroom like this in order to do good play therapy. But on the other hand, you can really see how this is a space that would draw and attract children and invite them to open up and to express any kind of stories or themes or play that they might want to do. So, in general, the play therapist approach is less formal. And I do a lot of consultation with play therapists around New York State. And a lot of times, one of the questions that I ask therapists early in their play therapy training is, how much time are you spending sitting in a chair? Because that's a good indication of how well we're creating a playful space. So we want to have a balance of movement, and we want to follow the child and kind of align with the child, even with our nonverbal posture and all of that. So, I particularly like this picture of the gentleman with the necktie and the wizard's hat. That's a favorite. All right, so this kind of gets to sort of the guts of what I wanted to talk about today, because it's something that I had trouble wrapping my head around when I was a new play therapist, because I would hear a lot of different activities, a lot of different approaches promoted as play therapy, but some of them seem quite contradictory. So I want to talk about the continuum, and the continuum is a continuum of how directive to be with the child. And, so when a child comes into my space, if I'm a non-directive or child-centered play therapist, then I am going to invite the child to use the materials in the playroom pretty much any way they want. And then my job is going to be to support that. I'm going to be neutral for the most part. I'm going to notice and reflect what I see. And we'll talk a little bit about what words I use to do that in a moment. But my theoretical approach in the child-centered approach is that the child will use the environment to create his or her own mastery experiences, and that my job is really to facilitate that without interfering with it too much. Because every time I give a direction, I'm shutting down some of what would otherwise have been possible for the child. So that's that's really the foundation of play therapy. That's the tradition of play therapy, and there are a lot of play therapists who still primarily practice in that way. And so it's really based on a belief system that children have the power to heal themselves, and that we just have to provide the right environment for it. So on the along the continuum, our kind of middle ground is what's called a child-responsive approach. So it's based on child-centered, invitation, where the child is still invited to take the lead and to play the things that they, play anything they want with the materials. Based on the themes of that play, in the child-responsive mode, the therapist might step out of that purely neutral role to sort of influence or respond to what they're seeing. And in that sense, invite some mastery experiences within the play, if they're not happening already. And then finally, directive play therapy is where the therapist leads and the child responds to the game or the invitation that the therapist is making. And so the therapist, this is more based on the therapist's assessment and then invitations to mastery. Now, as a prescriptive play therapist, I am using some strategies from all along the continuum based on the child and based on how therapy is going. But in general, I begin in a child-centered way. And as I learn more about the child and the themes emerge, I might begin to do some directive activities to support the therapeutic goals. A lot of my kiddos are kids who've been exposed to trauma because that's my specialty. And what I had found is that because of, the way trauma works and the way that children will sort of isolate or become phobic of any reminders of the trauma, I discovered that in a pure child-centered play therapy, some children would never play themes that were, carried enough of the trauma content for us to get some of that work done. And so then I had to find ways to be more directive. But I believe that the best play therapy relationship begins with being child-centered as the foundation skill. And then we step out of that as needed, but that we're always trying to return to that mentality as much as possible, while we try to meet the child's goals. So one of the, kind of going into more detail on each of these, the method of child-centered play therapy, the therapist's role in the child-centered play therapy is to track and notice out loud what's going on in the play. So you don't want to just sit there and be an audience and be, because that can be, a silent adult is sometimes sort of a threatening adult to children. So you're reflecting and noticing enough that you can, that the child, knows that you're paying attention, And also some of the reflections help to hone in on some of the things that might be important for the child in mastery. What I love about child-centered play therapy is that it builds a non-hierarchical relationship in the playroom, where the child and I are kind of together creating the experience, and it's not yet another experience for this child of adults telling them what to do and what's wrong. So some of the kinds of words that a therapist would use in child-centered play therapy it's interesting because when I try to teach this to people, they think it sounds so easy, but in fact it's really, really hard not to ask questions because in child-centered play, the therapist doesn't ask questions. The therapist describes things, including, even a child who's sort of not doing much yet and is just kind of wandering around. I might say something like, you're deciding what you want to do, which is sort of an empowerment kind of statement. Or you know just what you want to do, which is something that I say a lot to kids when they're getting started and they're kind of getting everything set up. The child-centered play therapist uses descriptive reflections, like, oh, I see that big one chasing the little one. We try not to label things just in case that tiger that the child's using is actually their pet house cat. So we, try to use kind of general descriptive terms, but it's keeping the connection going, and it's helping the child to see that we're interested in paying attention. We do have to set limits sometimes in the playroom, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. And we also might do some attunement or some verbalizing or emotional literacy just in the form of reflection and description. And I try to do that with a very light touch and use words like might, like, oh, that one might be scared. He's sort of acting scared. And the child will often correct me if I'm wrong because we've set up this egalitarian relationship. So it's Gary Landreth who coined this acronym for how to set limits in the child-centered play therapy because, everything doesn't go, particularly if children are trying to be aggressive towards me or doing some kind of play that, triggers me, crosses my boundaries. What Gary Landreth teaches us is to use this acronym ACT. So first we acknowledge the feeling or the desire. Well, I see that you want, to show anger right now, but I'm not for hitting, so that's communicating the limit. So instead, why don't we use this big pillow for that? Or we could use one of the puppets for that, so that story can still unfold, and the child can still get the job done, but I've set the limit, an appropriate limit, so that I don't feel uncomfortable in the play. And so obviously we could spend a lot of time on this aspect, and indeed in formal play therapy training, we spend a lot of time on how to do this with finesse. All right, so I just wanted to show you very quickly, these are recreations of some kinds of play therapy things that would happen. In child-centered play, children often will set up situations where there's a threat that has to be contained. And it's interesting because we know that a lot of our clients are dealing with, threats both real and perceived and danger in their lives. And then they come into the playroom and they're having an experience of trying to get a handle on that. And, of course, as therapists, we're paying attention to their safety, outside of the playroom as well. But sometimes it has been helpful to me to get a felt experience of just how intense the situation is for the child. And this is an example of this, kind of dynamic sandbox play. It's a still photograph, can't really capture just how emphatically this child both attacked over and over again the house and then, defended it as well with a lot of the characters that are in my playroom. I also think it's really important to have in your materials some way to contain threat. And so I have this big wooden jail that moves up and down. And, sometimes kids will be, in the midst of drama where the threat is really pretty intense and profound, and they'll be looking around for some way to contain it and get it under control. So that's an example of how that would look. So, all right, so that's, child-centered, and, I mentioned that I move on the continuum sometimes based on the needs of the child, and I especially tend to do this because of being a trauma therapist and wanting to give children an experience of digesting the trauma through the play therapy, and I actually do a whole training on how to do this without being too disruptive to the neutrality and the projective space of the playroom. So using a lot of I wonder language in order to shift the metaphor there. So here's an example of I gave more of a prompt, an invitation, so that's a tiny bit of direction, just to facilitate for this child kind of starting to do some of their present trigger work. And this was a sand tray that this is an older child, like a 10-year-old, made about just her projecting her feelings about the divorce before and after. And actually that the structure that you see in the middle is actually a play courtroom that someone made for me. And when kids ask me what it is in the playroom, I just tell them it's family court. So, you can see some of her feelings about that kind of projected there. A lot of kids who are in divorce situations, when they're invited to, set up a world in the sand, they will do these divisions. They'll do the kind of back and forth. I was very encouraged to see that there is at least a bridge in that one. So, in directive play therapy, we use planned interactions to accomplish goals, and a lot of times this is built on some of our other skills that we already have as therapists, such as CBT. What I wanted to do, as time permits here, is we're going to do a little directive interaction together in a minute, so play therapy intervention. But one of the things is when you're doing more directive invitations, you probably already know this, but there's more defiance and more resistance the more directive the therapist is. And so just to have a mentality that a lot of times resistance or defiance is actually regulating. So the child is saying, this is too much, I'm getting flooded in some way, and so I'm not going to play your game. I'm not going to play your feelings game because I'm having trouble responding in a way that feels safe. So trying to give kids a lot of choice and a lot of flexibility, even in directive interventions, is really important. And of course, we know that defiance is often about attachment patterns, and that sometimes children are really not in, what Paris Goodyear-Brown calls the choosing mind. So when a kid's survival, fight-flight system is activated, it's not possible for them to make a good choice in those moments, and that's something we need to keep in mind in the play therapy room. It's also something that we can teach parents, to help their child calm before they give them the choice or consequences of chat. All right, so I wanted to give you an example of, how a directive intervention might work, and I do this Stomp the Worry Bully a lot for anxious kids. So I'm going to invite you to do this. It's right there at your desk because grown-ups have worries too. So the first thing we do is we draw a picture of the worry monster. So this is, a strategy where we've kind of made the idea of worry into a playful idea, which is that it's almost like there's this worry bully in your mind that tells you to worry about things you don't really need to worry about, but he just tells you to get all upset about it. When he gives you yucky thoughts, for example, that something bad's going to happen. A lot of my kiddos are afraid to go to school. Maybe they're afraid to be away from mom. And the worry monster tells them that if they go to school, bad things will happen. Even though part of their brain knows that a lot of times school is fine, that's what the worry monster does. So I have them draw it, or often for this worry bully game, we'll just use some monster from the playroom. And I have certain items that tend to be chosen to be the worry bully over and over again. So if you want to draw a little picture right now of what do you think that worry monster that tells you that you're not going to get your paperwork done, or that you're not a good enough therapist, or whatever our worry monsters say to us, draw a little picture of that, what that monster looks like, and we're going to use it in a minute in a playful way. Because some of you who do CBT are going to recognize that this is straight out of the CBT handbook. Together, me and the child would come up with some boss back words or some ways to talk back to the worry monster. And a lot of the really simple ones work well. Things like, I can handle that, or I'm good enough, or my best is good enough, or I'm fine right now. You can't bother me right now. Everything's okay. So, obviously we're teaching positive coping, positive cognitions that we would use to counter the negative, persistent negative ones. And so with kids, it's really good to keep it simple, right? And then what we do is we, have a, kind of playful battle to take action against the worry bully. And what works great for this is I have foam swords, and actually now I've kind of gone almost exclusively to using pool noodles cut in half as my swords because they're cheap and it doesn't hurt if you get accidentally hit. Or kids will rip the paper that they drew it on, or they'll, they will scribble it or cut it out. So I don't have my worry bully. I didn't draw it yet. So let's see if I have this. If I have my worry bully that says that everybody has signed off the webinar already and they're too bored, or whatever my worry bully would say. Here's my worry bully. So, and then we'll say our positive coping statements while we attack the worry bully. So if you made a worry bully for one of your worries, now you can say that your best is good enough, and let's rip the paper. Ready? Now, throw it across the room. And me and the kid will run around and jump on it and yell at it. And for a kid who's highly, highly anxious, this is very cathartic session. And CBT never looks so fun, right? And so, with the pool noodles, we'll together, beat on whatever we pick to be the worry monster. And it's just, and a lot of times kids will want to repeat sense. So now I have them repeating their positive cognition. And you have to pay attention to how activated they get during this, and, make sure you modulate with deep breaths or maybe intersperse with some other activities. But I've also had some kids do this at home, with the support of their parents as a way to kind of work through that. So modulating and repeating is an important part of the intervention as well. So, all right. So there is so much to learn about play therapy. I just put some books here. Some of the things that, we talked about, Gary Landreth's book, Dibs in Search of Self, which is Virginia Axline's case study, seminal work in play therapy. And then there's also a lot of books around play therapy to heal trauma, play therapy blended with CBT, which is kind of similar to what we were just doing a minute ago. So I really encourage you to dive in and do some reading. I want you to know that there is an increasing body of evidence to support play therapy. Play therapy didn't really lend itself well to a lot of research because it's a non-standardized intervention. But the research is growing, and there are several models of play therapy that are listed by SAMHSA as evidence-based, before they stopped listing new therapies. And there are many others that are listed as research-supported. So when a colleague tries to tell you that it's not evidence-based treatment, you can tell them that that is not the case. And also play therapy is a way to deliver a lot of other evidence-based treatments, such as EMDR and other, trauma protocols. You can deliver all of those treatments in a play therapy manner, so that's important too. So just some ideas, if this has gotten you juiced up, about how you could take some next steps in play therapy. One is by joining the Association for Play Therapy, and they do trainings. They have listings of trainings. There's e-learning that you can do. And also there's a credential called the Registered Play Therapist, which is overseen by them, and which, if people are serious about play therapy, is really the way to get good and to use play therapy responsibly in treatments. is to engage in the process of becoming an RPT, which includes some continuing education as well as consultation and supervised practice with children. And there is a New York State Association, New York State chapter for play therapy, which I'm actually involved with. And I'm happy to tell you that we have a state conference every year, which is 2 days of play therapy training, and we're welcoming everybody to Buffalo for the coming year. So the first weekend in April in Buffalo, it will be Lisa Dion's Synergetic Play Therapy for 2 days in Buffalo. It's going to be so fun. So you can look on our website for that. Really thinking about getting more continuing educational play therapy is so important. There's a number of people around the state who train in play therapy. If anybody's in Western New York, I do a spring series every year. It's up on my website of more intensive, hands-on practice training in order to become a play therapist. And, of course, more toys is always the answer for those of us who are play therapists because we never really grew up. So here's an example of the kind of toys that I appreciate. This is Meebe, who has Velcro features and can look happy or sad depending on the day, and has a whole bunch of different Velcro features. And kids use a toy like this in a million different ways. But you can also just go to yard sales or steal your children's toys, which I've been known to do. So I think this is the point at which Kara's going to come back on, and we're going to answer a few questions before we wrap up for today. So, Kara, are you there?
I'm here. Hi. So sorry, I forgot to unmute me. Thank you so much. This is just so fantastic, and we are getting a lot of comments about how fun the exercise was, how wonderful this presentation is. So I just want to start there, but we do have a lot of questions, and we're not going to get through all of them.
Fast.
Okay, so one of them, based on the activity, was, does the child need to be able to understand what their worry is before participating in the activity? Maybe we could start there.
So that's a good question. Again, with directive activities, that is the way I showed it to you as a directive activity. I think that I usually at least have some idea, or the child has some idea, what's a possible content to their worry, because you're relying on kind of the logic, the talk back to your worry with logic, kind of strategy, if you're thinking about it from a CBT standpoint. What's interesting is that children will play that kind of drama often in child-centered play as well. So, in terms of it being explicit and directive and about them, that's how some children can do it. But often, long before we get to that point, I have a kid who is just coming in and acting out a lot of kind of externalizing the anxiety in the form of wanting to, do have a battle with the pool noodles, wanting to slay the dragon in the sandbox. And so you can kind of see how that theme might be, and that would be a kid whose, worries are maybe more diffuse than not so specific. But, I do like to move kids towards the ability to do some interventions that are about them, where the self is explicitly present. But I often build to that point through the child-centered play, in which we may or may not know what the worry is about. Depends on, how literal the play is, because a lot of times it's not. So I don't know if that kind of addressed that.
Mm-hmm. Chat in if it didn't address your question, and we'll keep an eye on that. But I think it sounds like you did. Another question is a few times has shown up here is, at what age is the youngest that you start with play therapy?
Yes, good question. So, I've worked with a lot of 3-year-olds, in the kind of play therapy setting that I described to you today. Younger than that, I have often invited parents and, like a caregiver and child in together. And in that sense, I would tend to do more of the Theraplay type intervention, which is something I mentioned kind of towards the beginning. It's a directive parent-child dyad therapy, which it's a kind of a separate name brand, therapy training. But it teaches the parent to engage and nurture and structure their children's interaction, and also helps the child build up an experience of accepting that. And a lot of times when you have like a 2-year-old or a younger kid, attracting the attention of therapy, it's because there's been some kind of breach, whether this is a child with out-of-home placement or adoption, or maybe the parent had an illness or an absence, and now they're trying to reconnect. And so it's a directive therapy where you basically teach the parent and child to play together in a very attached and responsive way. So that's how I would do. With younger than 3, that's how I would tend to intervene.
Great. Thank you. Someone asked, how do you determine fact or false during play?
I think if I understand the question correctly, I think what the questioner might mean by that is when you're seeing a child kind of in fantasy play with a lot of intensity, are they telling, is this intensity about their lives? Is this somehow kind of a literal reenactment of something, or is it pure fantasy? And I think, play therapists have to have kind of a healthy skepticism. Skepticism's not even the right word, but I don't assume that what children are playing is their literal story. I'm interested in the overall themes. I'm interested in the emotional content and the intensity, and whether or not things feel real or do they feel playful. A lot of kids play out aggression themes. I can remember when my son was little, he had, 7,000 toys in his room, and they were all heavily armed, and they spent every day having wars. But some of the interesting things about that is that there was often a lot of fair play in those stories. There was a lot of honor. Those were some of the themes. Some of the kids that present clinically, that's not what the themes are like. The themes are more disturbing. They're darker. There's trickery or betrayal as a recurring theme, or loss. The lost item that's never found, unresolved loss. So we're looking more for patterns, and so I never make any conclusions, based on a single session of play. I can't tell you what's going on. It's more patterns that help reveal what parts are true. So.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And we have time for one more question. I'm so sorry. There are so many questions, and I hope this means we could have you back someday. But
it was very fun. The hour went super fast. I had to talk fast.
It did. The last question is going to be about Legos. Someone asked how you felt about Legos. I said you love them, but do you have examples of how to use them, they were wondering.
Yes, and actually, interestingly, I don't have Legos in my playroom right now. So any material in the playroom, there's this balance between, things that take a lot of time to assemble or only have one way to assemble, versus things that have the potential to carry narrative. I think Legos are fine, fair game. I would avoid having directions for prescribed ways of building, because a lot of times we get Legos in sets, and there's like there's a prescribed way to build a certain thing. That's super fun at home, but it's not really a therapeutic way to play necessarily, especially if you're trying to create kind of an expressive environment. On the other hand, I would say that when you're working with older kids, tweens and teens, a lot of times I will use any kind of playful activity as a way for us to be doing something, and then we can insert a little bit of the talk therapy kinds of stuff in between. So I can see that would be another potential. I do a lot of my colleagues have Legos, and especially, they even have the little Lego people and all that. So, so I don't see any reason why not. But just keeping an eye on anything in the playroom that has kind of only one way to play with it is, a little bit concerning, because then you're kind of shutting down the expressive possibilities for the child.
Great advice. Okay, I think we need to wrap it up, but here is Anne's email. Is it okay if people reach out to you?
Absolutely. And also, go to my website, and I would love to welcome some of you to this end of the state for some training if you're interested. Or I can give you information about training that I know about at your end of the state, if need be. So.
Fantastic. And if you have questions for us, ctac.info@ny sorry, I moved that too fast, at nyu.edu if you have other questions for us. And upcoming events, we have the Importance of Identity Affirming Care by Jama Shelton, which is going to be on Monday from 12 to 1, and we're really excited to hear from Jama. And just real quick, we wanted you to know you're going to be getting emails about this. It's time to review your profile. So it's time to update your profile at registration.nytac.org. Starting November 18th, you're going to receive a one-time prompt to review and update your details. So we'd really appreciate if you could do that, and just wanted to give you a heads up about it. This is what it will look like. And that's all we have for today. I'm sorry we went 1 minute over, but we really appreciate your participation today. And Anne, we just so truly appreciate your wisdom and your knowledge and all of the great information you shared today. This was just fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone. See you another day.